Welcome to Flyover. Please welcome Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. Is there a difference in the side of your philosophy work? Um, do you enjoy like working with your students more than your private work, or do you enjoy your private work more than your students?
Hmm. That's a difficult one because I do really enjoy. I love te I must admit, and actually, I would, to be perfectly honest, I don't think everyone. I really like teaching, and I don't think that many academics actually do. I think it's like, oh God, what they have to do when, like to make up for their hours or something, right? And they try to get rid of their classes if they can. Most people. I love to teach. Well, at least I love to teach them the subjects I love. So philosophy of mind, metaphysics, psychedelic research, so on and so forth, these kind of things. Ethics to a certain extent as well, actually. Um, but I have got an E&R contract, which means education and research contract. So 40% of my time is research, and I do enjoy that as well. I do love writing essays, see it as an art form in many ways. So I like to think of, the entire composition of it. I mean, this is what I mark students on as well, to a certain extent, the style. Is it clear? Clarity always key. But sometimes are you sacrificing style for clarity? You can be too clear and boring and dull. It's like real. You learn. I'm still learning. You learn it constantly, and you read great writers like Borges. I was just reading, and you try to learn, and so I do. But I do like doing my research a lot as well. So yeah, I'm currently looking at going back to Hegel and Fichte and Schelling. I did my master's dissertation on Kant and Schelling in relation to intellectual intuition. And I've always appreciated idealism, but with Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, this British philosopher who taught later in life in Harvard, died in 1947, influenced by James to a certain extent. Um, he kind of got me out of idealism into realism, which is not much different to be honest, but it just simply means that, part of the world that you see actually becomes part of you. So you do have a direct causations direct through, as it were. You absorb the outside world to a certain extent. And this kind of way of thinking, yeah, it's always interested me. And that's when I look at what shall I say, um, public philosophy to a certain extent, that way of thinking is coming back into fashion. With like people like Kastrup, his idealism, and Christoph Koch, his neuroscientist, who's now turning to idealism, and Hoffman and people like that. This kind of, because it was never actually refuted. The interesting thing about idealism, British, German, and then British idealism, absolute idealism, is there was never like a knockdown argument as to why it's wrong. It just kind of the fashion's moved on, partly because of the war. Like there's an anti-German feeling and so on. But yeah, so I'm doing a lot of research, looking back at that, looking at the detailed arguments. I mean, they're superior really to the modern ones. That you can find these great German thinkers for the most. And like I said, now particularly interested in how that relates to politics, um, and yeah, world movements and so on, which then brings back ethics. So it's pretty fascinating. Pantheism. I've just written an essay on this, and its relationship to world religion, to idealism, to the communist revolution, eventually to capitalism, everything in the cosmos, it's all interrelated, but it's quite fascinating. So that's my research. Also looking into philanthropy, interestingly, the whole world of philanthropy, which is very important as an academic, of course, it's kind of doesn't sound philosophical, but there's interesting aspects to it, in terms of like, getting on with people psychologically, it's related to the politics of the time. People also like, the interests of the rich, right? Like giving towards metaphysical causes, for example, or by which I mean, like research and metaphysical research, things like this. How that actually might be related to people's mental health. Um, so all of these very interestingly interconnected things interest me. But yeah, no, as a result, it's a busy life. I've also got two children and a wife, and And also like director of Breaking Convention, which is a large conference on psychedelics happening in a few months. Got 1,800 people, as well as another project, Mind at Large project. I'm working with some Americans on, like Matthew Siegel and Andrew Davis, Andrew Schwartz, people like that. Yeah, so and then all the marking on top of that, and the teaching. But it's all doable. It's all doable, just about, But you have to have breaks now and again so you don't burn out. I think burnout is actually like a big issue with academics as well. Like you can easily think, I'm just going to do another month of this because the deadline's coming up or whatever. And then I've got close. I haven't properly burnt out, but I've come close to it. I think, it's when you can't, you look at, you're about to write an email, for example, and you just can't function. You can't do it. You can't, and then you realize you need to take a week off, or a few days off at least.
Yeah, when you are hosting a psychedelic conference, does that get the British authorities interested in you? Or
Not to my knowledge, but I'm sure that there are undercover agents in amongst the. I'm not sure. I suspect. Um, Maybe there's a file on me. My lawyer friend thinks they probably got a file on you just in case you do anything, political or whatever. So I have to be a bit careful. But the general approach of the British legal network, police and law courts, is they don't care, and they see now the therapeutic value of psychedelics, and they think, well, that's should be permissible. Even Boris Johnson, our old prime minister, said in the House of Parliament a few years ago, like, well, maybe we'll make psilocybin, as it happens, the magic mushroom molecule. Maybe we'll allow that for research purposes, something like this. So there is certainly a turn. And Australia's, legalized or decriminalized MDMA and so on. Oregon, California, obviously, a number of American states are, turning the tide. So, yeah, it's not. I mean, there's another ethical issue actually. It's called psychedelic exceptionalism. Don't know if you've ever come across it, but
Hmm.
there's an argument that somehow psychedelics are seen as today as okay, like you don't need to like pursue this people who dabble with that, but cocaine, heroin, that's still very bad, and we need to sort of arrest these people. It ruins lives, blah blah blah. And then, there's a kind of, there's an ethical question as to whether this is based on class and race and so on. This kind of bias, it's an interesting question. I don't think it is. Personally, I think psychedelics actually are very different types of drugs to heroin and cocaine, for example. They induce altered states of consciousness, which are quite exceptional and they're used by, indigenous Americans and so on. So, yeah, but you can make the case both ways, and it's an interesting argument both ways, interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's definitely a part of national conversations, here on a regular basis. It seems like with cannabis, marijuana, like the government just gave up, but they're like fine. But
Yeah.
yeah, like you
So,
said, there's still wars going on with other stuff.
yeah, yeah. Cannabis is an interesting one. Also, when you look at the the past of it, the opium wars, very interesting how the British, imposed an opium trade, upon the Chinese, and how that was a kind of form of colonialism in a way. But then how opium inspired the Romantic movement to a certain extent, with Coleridge, especially Kubla Khan, stuff like that. So it's not a black and white issue, it never is. And then how we treat certain drugs as food, like sugar, it was introduced here only, you know, less than 1,000 years ago into Britain, and is a drug, of course, and everyone's addicted. But it's so common that we don't even classify it as a drug. Not to mention alcohol and tobacco.
Yeah, I'm massively addicted to sugar. Yeah, and caffeine. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Every
beer.
once in a while, I feel like a hero because like one of the things I do to be a good person, is I drink Diet Coke. So I'm getting my caffeine fix, which I'm consciously aware is a drug, but I'm no sugar. So
Well,
I'm
well done,
being
sir.
I'm being a good boy.
I always get my caffeine fix from tea. I don't like coffee anymore, actually. It's strange.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a fan of
Well, there's
both,
nothing.
but
I think it's good for you, tea. I tell myself anyway. It's probably better that I drink it than I don't. Um, Anyway, no one's gonna live forever, right? So
We'll see what we can do. I'm sure Elon Musk is working on it.
yeah. Well, hopefully he won't, but
Yeah. All right. Well, let me ask you a couple questions. I uh
go for it.
I gave you a little warning. Is there if anybody's watching this, like a student of any level, and they were thinking about coming into philosophy, is there a work that you think would be good to get them in? Like it's a nice introduction to philosophy.
Right. Gosh, it's a hard question because it really depends on what element of philosophy. But I'll give you a few books, and these are well, I think there's two strands here. There's books that I think are fantastic, necessary, Bibles of philosophy, and then there are what you're asking for, really, introductions, good introductions. Um, I think generally for metaphysics, which is my that and philosophy mind, um, a good starting book is Alfred North Whitehead's book, Modes of Thought, from the sort of 1930s. Um, I think for ethics, now you will know better than I do here, but one book actually I read just recently, but I thought I wish I'd known this book years ago, is A Short History of Ethics by Alistair McIntyre from the 60s, I believe. Don't know if you ever read that, but it's like, have you read that? I mean, I think it's a great
I
little starter.
I haven't I've read segments, and it's
Okay.
on my list of finishing off because I do read his work mostly after Virtue, which is part of my
Yeah,
research.
I like that as well. Aristotle versus Nietzsche. And that brings me to another one, actually, Nietzsche. Beyond Good and Evil, I think it's a good starting book. Now, what Nietzsche does to a lot of young people, and does to me, is he suddenly makes you question all of your ethical assumptions. Now, whether you agree with him or not, I think he's a great disruptor of conformist thinking. And as such, I think he's a good philosopher to read. But he is controversial, of course, and but that's what makes it more exciting. So I would say, and I think of all of his books, Beyond Good and Evil is one of his later books. It's split into small chunks. You don't have to read it in linear fashion necessarily. And also his style, even in English translation, the styling is brilliant. The form of writing. A lot of people who hate Nietzsche's philosophy, they love his style still.
I would be, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be my first choice, but I would think Twilight of the Idols would be a great introduction for anybody, it's basically him summarizing his work. I mean, there's issues. I mean, obviously he's sexist, like he's he's a little rude, but he's also entertaining and
Yeah,
bombastic and funny,
exactly. Yeah.
and it's interesting in there. I've
And he
always
would
said,
question, he would question, the whole basis of calling something sexist, even, right?
yeah,
So that's what makes him exciting. It's not just like, oh yeah, he's got that wrong, right? Because the judgment you make to criticize him, he would question himself. That's why he works on very deep levels sometimes, like contradicts himself purposefully, So you think about the issue. Twilight of the Idols, yeah, no, it's also a good one. I mean, yeah, as you say, it's shorter. I'll just say it's quite hard. I mean, it's really harsh, some of the stuff there. And you know what followed the Antichrist, of course, that's the hardcore, really, the last stuff. But um, yeah, Genealogy of Morality is also interesting. In fact, all his books are pretty good, really, I think. And it's dangerous though. They change it. They can change people quite radically, for sure. But like I say, the theologians I speak with, like the local priest here, they love Nietzsche because it's their topic, right? They're just like talking about the influence of how Christianity has pushed us in certain directions of thought, certain flows of thought in the West. Even when people say that they're an atheist or an agnostic or whatever, right? It's still they have got this, almost 2,000 years of Christianity is going to have an effect on a culture, whether you reject it or not. So he opens up that thought. Tom Holland, the historian, recently wrote a book called Dominion, where he's making the same point essentially, but it's giving more historical, sort of details of that, examples of it, really. So anyway, yeah, certainly Nietzsche, I think, is an eye opener. Nietzsche, though, is not a classic philosopher. He's not trained in philosophy. He was trained in philology, the study of language, and he says that psychology is the queen of the sciences. This is, concomitant to William James. I mean, he William James died when? 1912. Nietzsche died 1900, I think. So it's kind of anyway, yeah. So Nietzsche, one of Nietzsche's books, one of his later books, I would say still say Beyond Good and Evil, but maybe Twilight. I mean, the thing with Spinoza is, it's funny when I prefer Whitehead to Spinoza. Now, Spinoza was an influence on Whitehead, but when I teach Whitehead, he's got all these strange like concepts and neologisms and so on that people don't really get it fast, right? But Spinoza, the basics are very simple, like there's not mind and matter. There's just one substance of which mind and matter are expressions. And that one substance calls nature, but he also calls it God. Um, I mean, very basic take of it, but that kind of thing really appeals, I found, to a lot of people because it's a kind of not a religion. It's not, no, it's not religious, but at the same time, it's not materialistic. And it gives people that hope somehow, and like it expands their minds. And I think that the problem with Spinoza is not for beginners, it's very complex, like immediately. So it's kind of a pity in a way. So the ethics would be the sort of fundamental book by Spinoza, and it's called ethics, even though it's mostly about metaphysics, because the metaphysics is supposed to lead to a kind of virtue ethics, a kind of tranquility of mind where you don't blame people, you accept life as it is to an extent. So I would say the ethics, but beware that it's not easy. So not a good. So some secondary literature on Spinoza's ethics, whatever that would be. Silverman, I think, is good. Wolfson is good. Let me think. Yeah. Especially as good as yeah, there's a lot of good ones really. Silverman, R.M. Silverman, Baruch Spinoza, Outcast Jew, Universal Sage. I consider very good introduction. But that's hard. That's a bit hard to get hold of actually. What else is there? Bergson. I mean, one of the greatest books in philosophy ever written, in my view, is Henri Bergson's book, Matter and Memory. Again, very difficult. So, good starting book is Creative Evolution. That was his popular book, written in 1907. Really, really quite fantastic book. So he believes in evolution, but he just thinks there's more to evolution than neo-Darwinism has it. So yeah, I mean, you can get started with that. Um, Kant as well. I mean, for me, Kant's first critique was very influential, but again, extremely difficult to get into. So some kind of secondary literature in Kant. I mean, I must say with Kant, right? So this is what really threw me when I first started philosophy, So like I said, I never studied philosophy at school at all. My parents were not academics, they're artists, like I say. Um, and then I went, to study philosophy, and then Kant. We started with Kant in a way, which just like was a massive slap in the face, like wake up. So the thing, as you know, the main thing about Kant is really this idea, this transcendental idealism, which is that, the world we perceive is very unlikely to be the same as it is in itself, So there's the phenomenal world that we see, and then the noumenal world, as it were, which is the world in itself, the world, mind independently. And in a way, when you think about this, that we've evolved to see the world in a certain way, other animals are probably perceiving a different way, different colors, different qualia, whatever, different time rates. It's kind of obvious. Hume made the same point to a certain extent, and but I don't know, I just never thought about it. It was just never introduced to me before. It's so obvious now in a way. I mean, like I say, I moved from that idealism to a kind of realism where there's a little bit of a compromise, but yeah, so that kind of idea. Again, you would have to have some secondary literature on Kant to customize yourself to that, but I think that would be good. Hume's good actually. Treatise.
That is not a short piece though.
No.
Not a fan of short books, I can
So let
tell.
me let me just run down like um the introductory pieces. I would say Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, Whitehead's Modes of Thought, Silverman's Introduction to Spinoza, MacIntyre's Short History of Ethics, and and maybe my old teacher, Stephen Holgate's introductions to Hegel.
Well, Peter, it's a good list, but you've also come a long way. There's no Indian philosophy on there.
Well, you know what is very interesting. It was I looked at the etymology of the word pantheism,
Mhm.
and it goes back. People think it's John Toland, who's a very fascinating Irish philosopher that I wrote an essay about recently. But before him, it was coined, we believe, by a guy called Joseph Raphson, who was a kind of defender of Newton. And in 1697, he wrote of pantheism, so Latin for pantheism, and he referenced in his definition of pantheism Spinoza's philosophy and Indian philosophy. And when I talk about Spinoza, like I've given it a talk to the University of Delhi, for example, on Spinoza. There's incredible, interesting, you know, links between the two. And so, and I've got an Indian PhD student actually, Nana, who's working on something related to this. It's just something I would like to get into, but you know, I haven't got enough time to even look at the Western stuff of the last 200 years in this specific place near to me. So, well, I just think I leave the specialism of Indian philosophy to other people. You know, you just can't special. I mean, there's always, I mean, as you probably find yourself, right? There's always this question of balance. You know, do you go to breadth or do you go to depth? You know, there's always a question. You need to find balance there. And if you go too wide, include all the world religion, all the world philosophies, you know, you'll never get into any depth, anything. So, but who knows? One day, maybe.
You are you hit the problem nail square on the head. Yeah, it's a battle I've never really come up with a satisfactory victory for. I'm like, I get pulled, both ways.
Mm,
Peter,
mm.
thank you for doing this today.
It's been a pleasure.